Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third installment of the Comparative Judaism series, sponsored and hosted by Temple Beth Shalom. Our speaker today is Rabbi Anat Moskowitz. Rabbi Moskowitz has had a career spanning from therapist to Air Force chaplain to teacher to rabbi to the chaplaincy for the facility for Jews in addiction recovery, and even as a translator and tour guide in Disneyland. She and her husband have been foster parents to many disadvantaged children. She now serves on the staff of the Community Day School in Sarasota. Those who have heard her lecture a few months ago about Holocaust survivors can appreciate her breadth of knowledge. The talk will be between 35 to 40 minutes or so. After that, we'll have 15 minutes roughly of questions and answers. If there's time left over, I will give Rabbi Moskowitz the floor to make a few concluding remarks. Just a reminder that next Thursday is the concluding session of the series, and Rabbi Howard Siegel will be hosting a roundtable with Rabbi Steinmetz, Rabbi Shepron, and Rabbi Moskowitz. With that as an introduction, Rabbi Moskowitz, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. So, conservative Judaism. Obviously, I am a conservative ordained rabbi. I was ordained in 1999 in the movement, and I was raised in a conservative congregation. And so that's why I'm doing this, obviously. So if you look up conservative Judaism on the internet, Google will say, it will also add Masorti Judaism, which is outside of North America, that it is a Jewish religious movement that regards the authority of Jewish law and tradition as emanating primarily from the assent of the people and the community through the generations, more than from divine revelation. Conservative Jews regard the Torah as both divine and human, but having divine authority. They believe the Torah was revealed by God, but is a human record of the encounter between humanity and God and the Jewish people's interpretation of God's will. So that's what Google says if you were just to type in, what is conservative Judaism? Now, you know that the movements didn't evolve in the way that we describe them. People often say that Orthodox Judaism is the first, and then conservative Judaism, and then Reform, and then Reconstructionist. That order comes from just the idea of halakha, like how halakha is followed, how Jewish law is followed. But in reality, the Reform movement was the first movement. And then the Orthodox movement was a response to the Reform movement. And then conservative movement was a response to the Reform movement. And then Reconstructionist is a response to conservative movement. And then you have all these other variations of how people celebrate Judaism. And before there were movements, there was just Judaism, and people were either more traditional or less traditional, or more committed to halakha or less committed to halakha. So it's all about the food, is a comment. You know, as Jews, we can't have an event without food, which is, I think, one of the reasons why Zoom is not as exciting and not as calming as getting together, because we don't have the food part. But conservative Judaism began because of the food. So modern Judaism, Reform Judaism, was happening in the United States. And in the first ordination of the rabbis of this movement, they had this treifa banquet. And you can even type in treifa banquet and get this menu, which you can't really see very well, but it has things like clams and other kinds of shellfish and things that are, and milk and meat together, and things that are very, very not kosher. And this was the defining moment where the people sitting in the room looked at what Reform Judaism was presenting at that moment and said, this is not for me. I need more tradition. I need more commitment to halacha. And they separated from the Reform movement and created the conservative movement. And that's where we had Hebrew Union College as the Reform training institute for rabbis, and the Reform movement's college, and the Jewish Theological Seminary of America was the first conservative. It's the flagship institution of the conservative movement, formed in 1886. So it's all kind of recent, this whole movement thing. This is not going back to Sinai. This is an actual, really modern understanding of Judaism, these defining lines, is very recent. And as you know, Reform Judaism pretty much started in Germany, and then conservative movement pretty much started in the United States. And now we have conservative Jews everywhere, obviously. So the motto of conservative Judaism, as I'm sure you already know, is tradition and change. It is a honoring of the commitment to what the traditions are of our people, and at the same time evolving according to what modernity is saying about life. And so there's a lot of discussion and a lot of learning and a lot of tshuvot, a lot of answering of questions about what we can do as Jews. So basically, we believe it's incumbent upon the Jewish people to shape Judaism in every generation by grappling with traditional values and ideas with a contemporary context. So we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We keep what is traditional in Judaism. We keep that thread alive, and we weave it into what is the reality of being a Jew in today's times. For example, like electricity, right? It says in the Torah that we can't light a fire on Shabbat. That is the reason why we light Shabbat candles before Shabbat and then go into Shabbat without touching those candles, supposedly. And from there, the interpretation was, well, if you can't light fire, then you can't use electricity, because when the electric current moment happens, there is a spark, and that spark is the same as the spark that happens when a flame is lit, and so therefore electricity can't be used. And then the interpretation started happening. Can you really live in our day and time without using any electricity at all? And there's ways that Jews who are very committed to halacha deal with that, using timers, turning on lights before Shabbat starts, or saying that, you know what, electricity is not fire. I'm going to light the candles before Shabbat, and then electricity for me is okay to use. And so there's all these different interpretations. So we stay rooted in the wisdom, right? And the wisdom of our heritage, and at the same time acknowledging the progress of modernity. And that is, to me, authentic Judaism, right? It's authentic precisely because it's dynamic. It's a movement in action. There is an energy in conservative Judaism. And I know a lot of people are saying conservative Judaism is dying because a lot of people, especially young people, are more attracted to the Reform movement because services are shorter, more things are in English, it's easier to understand. But there are ways to do that within the conservative movement as well. We just have to make a commitment to making things user-friendly. And if we do that, then people can navigate their way in the conservative movement in such a way where they find themselves comfortable understanding what is happening in the movement, and yet this attraction to tradition, which a lot of people love the traditions of Judaism. And if we were to emphasize that more, then I think people would be more attracted to what conservative Judaism has to offer. So the tradition and change tachlis, what does that actually mean? The movement tolerates a range of religious practice in its commitment to halachic pluralism. The idea that multiple and opposing opinions concerning the requirements of Jewish law can be considered equally legitimate, right? So this idea of multiple and opposing opinions. So we accept Jews in all areas and all the regions within the boundaries of conservative Judaism. There is not one way to be a conservative Jew other than acknowledging your commitment to tradition and change at the same time. Most but not all conservative synagogues are egalitarian on gender issues, but not all. There are still conservative synagogues that do not count women in their minyanim, and there are still conservative synagogues that if they do, they might count women in the minyan, but they don't, they're still not open to women in leadership positions, women as rabbis. And the movement conservative movement allows for all of those arenas, all of those beliefs to be in the same arena. even though the conservative movement is ordaining women, obviously, as rabbis. And we're also, we've also moved a long way as far as same-sex marriages and the LGBTQ movement, where when I was ordained as a rabbi, you could not be gay and be a rabbi, but we could welcome gay and lesbians into our congregation as congregants, but we still weren't doing same-sex weddings. Where now that's all changed, and people who are out are allowed to be ordained just like everybody else. And we do have a format for officiating at a same-sex marriage. The marriage we're not allowed to officiate at is the interfaith weddings. And that's one of the things that turns people off to the conservative movement. We're trying our best to welcome in interfaith couples once they are married. But the challenges of marrying somebody who is Jewish and who is not Jewish, even halachically Jewish, like even a Reform person whose father was Jewish and their mother is not, because in the Reform movement, they accept patrilineal descent, which we do not accept in the conservative movement. I can't even officiate at that wedding. I would have to convert the partner who is, Reform accepted Jewishly to a conservative wedding. And I did a lot of those in my journey as a conservative rabbi. And it's off-putting to a lot of people, but there is one thing that we can say to people who choose to marry a Jewish person but don't want to convert to Judaism, and that is, I have to honor their reason for not converting to Judaism. They have some sort of ties to their religion of origin that they feel it's important to stay connected to, and they're not converting to Judaism for a reason. And it's very important that we honor that reason, and for that reason, I cannot stand under the chuppah and officiate at their wedding, because I cannot represent somebody who's not Jewish, because I am Jewish and I'm only trained to lead people who are under the umbrella of Judaism, and somebody who chooses not to be Jewish needs a different kind of officiant for their wedding in order to honor where they stand. So that's one of the ways that we can explain it to people in a way that they understand why we stand where we stand. But yet, as a rabbi and as a pulpit rabbi, I had to, obviously, I welcomed in interfaith families and learned to adjust the services and learn to explain things to people in a way that made sense for our traditional Jewish and Jewish families to the traditional Jewish and non-Jewish families. So Judaism is, conservative Judaism is authentic and dynamic. And I always cringe every time somebody says that Orthodox Judaism is authentic Judaism and that everything else is just a washed down version. And it's not true. And in my opinion, conservative Judaism is the most authentic, because we are constantly looking at our tradition and looking at the text, the Torah text, and looking at what we say God expects of us, and taking that into our walk into Judaism. So this book, The Mind of the Talmud, I'm a big Talmud fan, so I love studying Talmud. So he's a JTS professor, David Kramer, points out in his book, The Mind of the Talmud, which is an intellectual history of the Bavli, our core text, the Babylonian Talmud. It embodies the recognition that truth, divine in origin, is on the human level indeterminable. In the end, we have no direct access to ultimate authority. Our Judaism begins with the observation that we are engaged in a multi-generational quest to reveal ever-changing responses to the core questions of religious life, theologically and practically. Our unshakable commitment to halakha, which literally means in Hebrew, to walk. Lalechet, halakha, these are words of actual walking. So when we're following halakha, which is usually translated as Jewish law, we are walking with God. We are following the statement in Micah of walking with God, which I love. When I'm following halakha, that puts me in the path of walking with God and walking with our tradition and walking with our people and our heritage. It's about how we answer the pressing questions, the process, and not just about a commitment to specific rules, the content. So while conservative Jews may practice Judaism differently in Los Angeles, Toronto, Mexico City, and Kfar Saba, and while our practice may differ from that of our grandparents in Lviv or Baghdad, we are all united across time and space in how we discuss and resolve questions. We look to precedent and we apply shared principles that govern change. In this way, conservative Judaism stands out among the other denominations. Our Judaism is authentic and dynamic. This constant asking of questions and trying to resolve ways of maintaining our tradition and our connection to our history as a people and evolving to address the needs of what it means to live in modern day and time, to me makes it, and also to Professor David Kramer, makes it authentic and, again, dynamic. And it's one of the, I think, one of the best explanations of what conservative Judaism is, and this idea of walking with Judaism. And it's why we also, when we're in shul, if we look around, we're all in the same space and we're all davening in the same language and in the same way, but we all approach our Judaism a little bit differently, and that mosaic is accepted under the umbrella of conservative Judaism, which I love. So Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson is a good friend of mine, and he is my rabbi's rabbi. He is, I'm sure you've heard of him, and I think he was the one that came out to do the installation for Rabbi Werbo. So I'm sure you know who he is. On the picture, he's in the far right. And I knew him before he was a big macher. But now he is the dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and he's a bigwig in the movement. And one of the things that Rabbi Artson brings to the table is this understanding of covenant. We talk about Brit a lot. Obviously, when a baby's boy is 8 days old, that's when we make this big deal about the Brit. But Brit, as you know, means covenant. It is a two-way agreement. And I love Artson's way of understanding what conservative Judaism is. So God and the Jewish people share a sacred responsibility and a bond of love, which expresses itself in our Brit. The Brit remains a central pillar of Judaism and has come to symbolize the mission of the Jewish people, to be partners in creation with God, to pursue the sacred task of bringing the knowledge of God to the world, to be a nation of priests, a nation of holy people. According to the Torah, our purpose is to make the world more just, sacred, and compassionate. In other words, more closely reflecting the image of God. Judaism guides us in this sacred task by inspiring us to work to repair the world, the tikkun olam. On a personal level, we strive to cultivate sensitivity, learning, and decency. And on a communal level, we work to foster the ideals of chesed, of kedusha, and of tzedek. The mission is made concrete through the implementation of the mitzvot, believing that thought without deed is incomplete. Mitzvot concretize God's will, thereby connecting us to God. The many mitzvot, giving substance to God's brit, reflect divine love in every aspect of the human endeavor. Through mitzvot, we have the potential to transform each moment of our lives, even the most prosaic, into an encounter with the divine. I love this explanation so much, this idea of this covenantal relationship. When we complain about the world and about God, or we're arguing with God about why the world is the way it is, or things that we don't love about what's happening in the world, this reminder that we are partners with God and that God relies on us as much as we rely on God. That is what the covenant means. That is what the brit means, that you do your part and I do my part. And together we get the work done. So this covenantal relationship with God and with community, to me, is everything. I love this idea. I often tell the story to children about creation and how the angels were kept asking God after every step, is the world finished yet? And God would say, not yet. And then God created some more things. And the angels kept asking over and over if the world was finished. And God kept answering, no, not yet. And at the end of these days of creation, the angel said, okay, are you finished yet? Is the world finished yet? And God says, I don't know, go ask my partners. And in that way, it is our responsibility to partner with God to do the tikkun olam, to do the fixing and the repairing and the constant building of what this world is. And how do we do that, right? We do that through following God's commandments, by following the mitzvot. We talk about mitzvot often as good deeds, but they really are commandments. It's not an option to follow the mitzvot. Now, Judaism gives, obviously, and I talk about the conservative Judaism, obviously answering questions about how we can continue to follow the mitzvot through logical, analytical ways that make sense in modernity, but at the same time acknowledging that these are commandments that come from God. And in that partnership, we have the encounter with the divine in the work. So going back to the word halakha, right, following law, but halakha meaning to walk with or to go with or the journey with, however you interpret it, is how we connect and walk with God, which is, I think, an amazing statement of who we are. And so in addition, to give you a visual of what it means to walk with God, the mitzvot evolved through a long process of interpretation and debate into the body of law known as halakha, based on dual pillars of written Torah, the Bible, the Torah, and oral Torah, right? That includes the Talmud, in the Mishnah, the Talmud, the codes, and the tshuvot, the legal rulings of later rabbis. Halakha allows us to seek God's will and apply that will in each generation, because the halakha remains the basis for all authentic Jewish practice. Conservative Judaism recognizes that no living body of law can be frozen or fossilized, and holds dear the notion that the Torah is meant to serve us as a road towards the knowledge of God and not as a barrier keeping us back. And as I said, the very word, the word halakha is connected to the word for journey, to go with, and that guides and shapes us as a community. And acknowledging the established rules remain constant throughout the ages, the interpretation and application of these rules is shaped anew by emerging realities, innovative technologies, and new insights. Again, modernity, the reality of the world we're living in, while still giving honor to the halakha, still giving honor to the law and our tradition and the way our people have done things for so many years. And so this is obviously halakha according to Artsen. He's my official rabbi. I learned from many, many rabbis, but he's definitely defines a lot of Judaism for me. Okay, so what is conservative Judaism in Israel? Again, a reminder, conservative Judaism is often called the middle movement, right? Because most people see Judaism as Orthodox being the way to do it, authentic, black and white, this is the way you follow God's law. Conservative Judaism being the middle. Did somebody unmute themselves? Okay. Conservative being the middle of the road, and Reform movement being the less observant of the movements. But as we know, again, it's Reform, Orthodox, and then Conservative in order of how they came about historically. And so in Israel, as you know, there's no separation of church and state. And so Jewish law is the law of the land as well as the religious law of the land. And so that has created some chaos in Judaism for people who don't follow Orthodox law. And so in talking about the miracle of what Israel is and what happened to the Jewish people and the restoration of our ancestral home, Israel, right? The basis of communication in Israel is all Hebrew. If you go to Israel and you open up a prayer book in a church, you'll see it's also written in Hebrew, which is really mind-blowing because we think of that as just our language. But again, it's the national language of Israel. And it's also our sacred language. My Saba, my grandfather, who immigrated from Libya, they came from Libya to Israel in the 1920s before Israel was an established state, when it was still called Palestine,
Time.
did not speak Hebrew because he felt that Hebrew was a language we spoke to God in, and that was a holy language that should be reserved only for God and our conversations with God. And so he spoke Arabic, interestingly enough, except to the grandkids, because we didn't speak Arabic, we only spoke Hebrew. So he spoke Hebrew to us, but he didn't like it. He wanted to stay in that honoring of the language being a holy language. But yet it is the national language, and you do everything in Israel in Hebrew, including, it's not just a holy language, it's the everyday conversational language. And so people cuss in this language as well, which is disconcerting for a lot of us, acknowledging that the language feels holy in our conversation to God. But we can talk to God in any language, obviously. But conservative Judaism tries to hold on to that holy conversation by maintaining a lot of our prayers in Hebrew and promoting Hebrew literacy throughout the diaspora. So we obviously support the State of Israel as a democratic and pluralistic Jewish center, and are committed to the idea of Aliyah. And we're also committed to this idea of the introduction of Masorti Judaism, which is what conservative Judaism is called in Israel. There are Reform Jews in Israel. There are Reform congregations in Israel. There are Reconstructionist congregations in Israel. But the most of it falls under the Masorti Foundation of Conservative Judaism, which is actually in New York City, but it supports, this concept of egalitarianism and accepting women wearing talis and tefillin and davening in an egalitarian minyan, and acknowledging the reality of what conservative Judaism means also in the United States, making it work in Israel as well, which is very important because a lot of Israelis do not find themselves in the Orthodox world. And they connect to Judaism better when offered a more user-friendly and liberal and egalitarian way of living Judaism. And I have tons of stories about my family in Israel, which I'll save for another time, but they range from everything from kibbutznik Jews to modern, to very, very Orthodox right-wing Jews, so Orthodox that they won't even, be in the same space as I am because I'm a woman, to being even Christians who support the land of Israel and who are Zionists. And that is all done in Hebrew in Israel, which is a beautiful thing. It is the connecting piece. It is one of the complaints that people have about the conservative service being so much in Hebrew. But again, there are ways to integrate English into the Hebrew, and ways of bringing music, and ways of teaching people how to say these words in Hebrew and how to daven in Hebrew. And we consider that to be very important in conservative Judaism. And so this is more of that. I'm just looking at the time. So obviously it's pluralistic and egalitarian and democratic. And everything that I've explained to you about conservative Judaism is under this same umbrella of Masorti Judaism in Israel. And trying to get equal recognition from the Israeli government for all Jews. And why that's super important is because obviously in Israel, education is paid for by the government, and people who have Orthodox synagogues and Orthodox schools get this funding from the government. And we also want the same for the Tali schools, the schools that are conservative or part of the Masorti movement, and the synagogues and whatever want to be held in the same place of honor as the Orthodox Jews and the Orthodox Jewish organizations. And also for matters of life cycle events. Jeff and I were married in Israel. We are not Orthodox Jews by any stretch of the imagination. And we wanted an egalitarian ketubah, and we wanted a conservative rabbi to marry us. And so we got married in that way. My family accepted it because Rabbi David Lazar has a beard and, wears a yarmulke everywhere and wears a white shirt and black pants and sandals. And that, for some reason, made him valid enough for my family to be able to marry us. But because we got married under the conservative movement, the Masorti movement in Israel, we were not recognized as married in Israel and had to leave the country and come back in order to be acknowledged as married. Because when you leave the country and somebody else in another country acknowledges you as married and you come back to Israel, then you are considered married according to Israel. It's mishigas, but while Israel is changing and evolving in the same ways, this is one of the challenges of the Masorti movement in trying to allow for a more pluralistic view of Judaism is the basic goal of Masorti Judaism in Israel. So even the conservative movement has different parts. So we have conservative 1, 2, 3, and 4. So conservative 1 would be now called conservadox, people that are closer to the Orthodox following of halacha than than conservative 3 and 4. So Schechter, Heschel, Lesser, and Kohut are some of the rabbis of conservative 1. Nature of revelation, continuous revelation. So it's not just a one moment thing, but God continually dictates God's will. So God dictated God's will at Sinai and other times, written down by humans. And because it's written down by humans, hence there's the diverse traditions in the Torah. Method of study, where in the Orthodox, the method of study is there's no distinction between pshat and drash. In other words, the meaning of the text is the meaning that the traditional commentators assign to it. And in conservative 1 and conservadox, it's more of a historical method. There's a distinguish between pshat and drash, determine pshat through literacy and historical analysis. The authority of biblical laws, again, is God's will, which is the same as in Orthodox. And the ability to change Torah's laws and ideas is the same as Orthodox, which is there is no ability and no authority, since God revealed the answers to all future questions at Sinai, and man does not know more than God. And the only exceptions is applications to new situations, which were also revealed at Sinai, and choice of one's position in codes over others. Other than that, man does not have the ability to change laws. And then there are places where there are clear scribal errors in the Torah and clear borrowings from other cultures in places of halacha to distinguish the divine and human element in our texts. Okay, conservative 2, Boxer, Gordis, and Rotenberg. Again, revelation is continuous, and human beings wrote the Torah but were divinely inspired. And the authority of biblical laws and ideas is, again, God's will. And the human ability to change the Bible's laws and ideas, human beings can change them because rabbis in each generation may be inspired to a new midrash. They must, because the rabbis of each generation are charged with the responsibility to keep Jewish law viable by balancing, again, tradition and change. And so most conservative Jews are finding themselves somewhere between conservative 2 and conservative 3, again, with this honoring of tradition and change. And the rabbis of each generation are acknowledging the changing realities of the world while keeping this tradition of our people alive. Conservative 3 is where I stand and where most of my teachers stand. So Elliot Dorff was one of my, Dr. Elliot Dorff is one of my favorite teachers in rabbinical school, along with Bradley Artson. And Rabbi Dorff wrote this book on conservative Judaism, which is worth a read, even though it's a little dated. I think the newer ones are a little bit more updated. So the Torah is the record of the human encounter between God and the people at Sinai. Since it was written by human beings, it contains some laws and ideas which we find challenging today. So when we're reading the Torah and we see laws of sexuality and things that were considered pagan laws and things that were kind of adopted by our people or were flipped by our people, we are recognizing that that was the historical reality of that time, and it got written into the Torah because people were writing the Torah. But it's also an encounter between God and our people at Sinai. So that magical moment that happened at Sinai is not just God telling us what to do, but is the beginning of the relationship. It's the beginning of the relationship between us, the people, right, and God. And so that's what that magical moment was about. And the nature of the authority of biblical law and ideas is, again, God's will and the covenant with God and the Jewish people of the past, present, and future. So it's a living Torah, and the halacha and the tshuvot are a living reality, right? That living connection between us and God, again, that covenantal relationship. And we continue to have encounters with God, and the law must be changed to reflect the new understanding of God's will that results from those encounters. It is the rabbis representing the community and not every individual on his own who determines the content of Jewish law in our day. So this is where most of us stand, somewhere between conservative 2 and conservative 3, but there are people, in our shul that are standing in conservative 1, and there are people that are standing in also conservative 4, and they are all welcome under the umbrella of Judaism. And one of the things that has happened over time is that Jews have evolved to not need these boundaries and these lines, and we are just, at some point, Jews. So conservative 4 is more leaning towards Reconstructionists. So Kaplan, Einstein, and Rabbi Schulweis. No revelation. They don't believe in revelation. Human beings wrote the Torah, and there's no claim for divinity of the product. They believe not that we are the chosen people, but that we are the choosing people, that we chose God, that we chose his moral and ethical center, that the authority of of the Bible's laws and ideas is tradition, custom, and internal wisdom, and communal authorities of each generation can and must help individuals reconstruct Judaism. Again, reconstruct, the word reconstructionist, right? Judaism with current and meaningful customs and ideas, but observance of rituals is voluntary, and an organized creative community of the future could establish and enforce moral laws, but not necessarily ritual laws, and more the idea that you follow ritual laws if it leads you to moral laws, which is also a reality of Reform Judaism. So ordaining women, and this is obviously super important to me as a woman rabbi. As a little girl, I held services in the backyard from the age of 5 on, and wanted to be a rabbi and was told that was not an option. So I was going to be the wife of a rabbi, which, I am not. I have a wonderful husband who makes a very good husband of a rabbi. But for many years, that was the game plan. And in 1972, when I was but 10 years old, I remember when women were ordained in the Reform movement, but I was never a Reform Jew. In those days, the lines were so strictly divided, and you didn't even go to Reform synagogue if you were a conservative Jew in my world. Like, you went to a conservative synagogue, and even when I went to Orthodox synagogues that my uncle helped establish and whatever, and I went for the openings, or I went to services with my cousins, I always knew I was a conservative Jew. That was always clearly defined. And so when I was picking my career, I didn't have the option of picking rabbi, so I became I got a degree in psychology and became, worked in therapy and then got a teaching credential and was a teacher, which those two jobs together allowed me to do the work of being, a pseudo rabbi until I was allowed to go to rabbinical school. So this woman, Amy Eilberg, Rabbi Eilberg, was the first conservative woman to be ordained at JTS, at the Jewish Theological Seminary. She was admitted to rabbinical school in 1984, but she had been there already as a Talmud scholar. She had become a Talmud scholar, and so she had basically learned everything you need to learn in rabbinical school. She only needed 1 more year. She was ordained in 1985, and again, she holds a very special place in the hearts of all women rabbis, because she broke. And even in the New York Times, you can see this little article on the left, Conservative Assembly votes to admit women as rabbis. It was a very big deal. I remember that moment very well. And so after that, women were admitted to JTS, and then the Ziegler School started in 1994. I was a JTS student when I started rabbinical school, and then I transferred to the Ziegler School because it was in California, and they were offering a 4-year program, which they no longer offer, but so I was ordained in 4 years instead of 6. But we owe a lot to Amy. She has worked as a chaplain and has written a lot of great things. She was never actually a pulpit rabbi. That was never her intention. But other women in her class did enter the pulpit. And so again, like I said, the boundaries have blurred. Very few Jews can say, I fall exactly in conservative 1 or conservative 2 or conservative 3. Most take a little bit of a smorgasbord idea to Judaism, and we take a little bit of this and a little bit of that in this mosaic, and I could also probably also capitalize that of mosaic as in Moses, but this mosaic of different colors making this beautiful picture of tradition and change. And Rabbi Leonard Gordon said, even as Judaism has always changed in response to a changing world, Judaism has also retained its distinctiveness. And I love that for conservative Judaism. Again, response to the evolving and changes in the world, but maintaining the special part that makes us dynamic and unique and beautiful and distinctive, the tradition of our people. And so that is my presentation. So opening it up to questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that. Hang on. Stop share. Okay, there we go.
Well, Rabbi, thank you very much for that very, very interesting and informative presentation. I will open up the floor to questions right now. If you do have questions, please just kind of raise your hand. There are 2 screens that I have. Each screen has 25 squares. I may not catch you on the first round. So I'm just going to go scanning around here. I have a question for the rabbi, but I don't want to be first in case someone, I don't want to, let's see. Do I see anybody with any questions? Let me just look around. Okay, no? Okay, then if that's the case, I'll break the ice.
Yep.
Rabbi, the Jewish Theological Seminary just announced a new chancellor who is a woman. And I just wondered whether you think that is, in terms of the timeline, is this earlier than what you would have expected, later than what you would have expected? And what do you see that her influence might be on the JTS?
Well, I think it's actually later. When I entered rabbinical school, again, being raised by Israeli parents who, my dad was a teacher and my mother was a principal, the lines of gender were not really something I understood as well. And I got to rabbinical school and they basically told me, well, you can be a rabbi if you follow basically man's law. So you have to follow everything that a man follows. You have to put on talis and tefillin, you have to follow the laws of what it means to be a man. And I actually had professors tell me that they didn't believe that women should be rabbis and that the conservative movement should not have started ordaining rabbis. And this was 10 years later. This was 1994 already. This is 10 years after the first woman has been admitted into rabbinical school. And there are still men that did not believe that women should be ordained. And there was a whole group of people that left the conservative movement when they started ordaining women in 1983 and 84. They just started their own conservadox movement, so to speak. So it was really challenging to be a woman in rabbinical school and to be hearing that. And I was actually the first woman ordained west of the Mississippi, right? Because I was ordained in the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, in the first rabbinical school on the West Coast that was ordaining. And so it was a big deal, which didn't make any sense to me, that women should still be a big deal as rabbis and in Judaism. So I feel like it's a little late, like we should have had a woman earlier, but the reality is the conservative movement was not ready. There were too many people who were not ready to hear a woman in a leadership role. So we had a woman that was president of the RA recently, And then now we have a dean. And I think what it's going to do is just normalize women in the movement. It's bizarre to me that the movement still has synagogues that don't count women in the minyan and that would never take a woman rabbi or. That's still weird to me in the conservative movement, but I have to accept where people are. And I think having a woman as chancellor is definitely going to just normalize and allow people to see women in leadership roles in the conservative movement as being just as valid as anybody else being in the movement. I mean, we now have transgender rabbis as well in the movement. There are people of all walks of life who are rabbis now. And it's becoming more and more normal for that, so.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? Looking around here. And Mr. Tridell, let me please unmute yourself, sir. Oh, and by the way, listen, before Al speaks, I just want to say one thing. First off, I want to thank Elliot Korn for always being the one to get these Zoom sessions going. A special thank you to Joel Service for recording these lectures, all of which can be seen on the Temple Beth Shalom website. And also a special thank you to Al Tridell as chairman of the Continuing Education Committee to organize all of these 4 events as well as the many other events the synagogue hosts. So thank you to those 3 gentlemen. Al, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marshall. One of the divides between Orthodox Judaism and Reform and Conservative Judaism is the issue of 2-day holidays. Do you think that conservative Judaism will move in the direction toward the reform, or do you think they're going to hold on to the 2-day holidays?
Well, some conservative congregations have already eliminated the second day of holidays. As you know, the tradition comes from anybody in Israel only has to celebrate 1 day, and then if you're in the diaspora, you celebrate 2 days. And it comes from the fact that in days of old, people did not have calendars. They did not know when the holiday started. They knew that, by looking at the moon, where they were in the month, but they didn't know when the holiday started. And there was this bonfire thing that went from town to town. And by the time it got to all the towns outside of the walled city of Jerusalem, it was the second day. And so people could celebrate the second day then as being as valid as the first day. So people celebrated both days as a tradition, a way of connecting to that. And then because we're in the diaspora, we still celebrate the second day. So in Israel, it's just 1 day, which makes holidays much easier. And in the Reform movement, because they are focused on, again, a commitment to ritual laws that lead to ethical laws. And so the ritual laws are not held in the same accord. I think that different synagogues are going to choose 1 or 2 day holidays depending on what feels right for the synagogue. I think there is a value in having the 2 days. Logically speaking, not everybody can take off on 1 day. Some people can take off on the second day, right? So then people can celebrate the holiday on the day that's convenient for them if not everybody's coming on both days. Definitely makes it easier for rabbis to only have it on 1 day because you don't have to lead a service for 2 days and write 4 sermons instead of 2 sermons. If you've got like Sukkot, first 2 days and last 2 days, but also if you are Shomer Shabbos and you follow the halacha of not driving and turning on electricity and not cooking on Shabbat and the holidays and whatever, it makes the holiday much more enjoyable when you don't have that extra day or 2. Personally, for me, it made it easier when I served a Reform congregation. Then we were members in a conservative congregation, so I would do my rabbi thing on the first day of the holiday, and on the second day I got to go to my conservative congregation. So again, it allows people that have a different schedule to have more opportunity. That is not the reason for having a second day, though. It is kind of a punishment for living in the diaspora and not living in Israel. That is one of the things that a lot of Jews talk about. There is a discussion in the Talmud about whether you celebrate 1 or 2 days if you are traveling. So if you are an American traveling to Israel on the holidays, do you have to celebrate 2 days of the holiday instead of 1 like they do in Israel, right? Because you're an American, so you're technically living outside the diaspora, but you're in Israel for the moment. And vice versa, if you are a resident of Israel and you travel outside of Israel during the holidays, how do you celebrate? Do you have to celebrate the 2 days, or do you get to celebrate the one day because you are Israeli? And the answer is, it depends on where your bayit is. Bayit, as you know, is the word for house, but that refers to your spouse. So wherever your spouse is, in those days, obviously it was only relating to men, but wherever your partner is, wherever your wife is, wherever your husband is, that's how you celebrate the holiday. So if you're traveling to Israel and your spouse is with you, your bayit is with you, then you get to celebrate one day. If your bayit is not with you and your spouse is in the States, then you have to celebrate 2 days. That's the Gemara's interpretation of it. I think it's up to the synagogues whether they want to do it 1 day or 2 days. There's no law in the conservative movement where you have to do the 2 days. So that, therefore, they can make that decision. If they can make the decision to not include women in a minyan and to not have a woman rabbi, then they can also make the decision to not have a 2-day holiday. I like the 2 days, but it depends on the synagogue.
I see a question from Joel Servitz. Joel?
I'm already unmuted. Yeah, I know you touched on this already in your talk, but I want to explain why I'm coming at this again. And this is about interfaith marriage. Certainly, I have 2 daughters and certainly wanted them to marry someone who was Jewish, but ultimately both of them married someone who wasn't Jewish, and one of them's now divorced, but that's neither here nor there. And they're, the one who's married to a non-Jewish man right now, he's a wonderful guy. He's an excellent, and I would certainly someone I would choose for my daughter, wish he was Jewish. So the point of my question is, can you see a path within the conservative movement to eventually coming around to recognizing that this is simply reality? I'm a person who just deals with reality as opposed to what I wish would happen. Do you see a path within the conservative movement to finding a way to accommodate interfaith marriages?
So a lot has changed since I was ordained. When I was ordained, you could not even go to the wedding if it was an interfaith wedding. You couldn't even be at the reception. You could not be at the wedding. You could not be at the reception. You would get kicked out of the RA if you were caught even going. So if my brother had married a non-Jew, I couldn't officiate. I couldn't say a prayer. I couldn't even go to the wedding. Now, a few years later at an RA convention, we turned off the lights and turned off the recorders and turned off the video cameras, and everybody had to turn off their phones. And all the rabbis sat and talked about how their daughter married a non-Jew, their son married a non-Jew, their brother married a non-Jew, and they were at the wedding and they said a bracha at the wedding. And it was about almost every person that came to this session obviously had a story to tell. Both of my stepkids married non-Jews. One is now a Christian and one is now a Catholic. My grandkids are not Jewish. My half-sister is one of those Christians I mentioned living in Jerusalem who's, a Zionist Jew. My stepdaughter got married in our backyard with a minister from Unitarian Universalist. I didn't say anything in the wedding, but I put on the wedding. I did not get kicked out of the RA. So now it's changed to where we can go to these weddings, and there are different circumstances. Obviously, if it's your child or whatever, there is an evolving way of looking at this dilemma. And there are rabbis in the conservative movement who are doing interfaith weddings, as we would say, under the table, where some of us know about them and some of us just, I can't hear you, I can't see you, whatever. And there have been rabbis that have been kicked out for doing that, have been caught and kicked out. And there are rabbis who are known for doing interfaith weddings. So it will change and evolve. It is one of the things that shuts the door in the face of a lot of people. The way I addressed it when I was the rabbi of a Reform synagogue, because basically every wedding that happened in my congregation was an interfaith wedding. I counseled the couples. I met with them and planned their wedding. I helped design the service and the ceremony. And then my cantor officiated at the wedding because I had a cantor in the synagogue. And then I sat in the congregation and came up and did the priestly blessing on them and gave a wedding talk and then went and sat down. And the cantor did the official, because in Colorado, a couple can name themselves married because they follow Native American law in Colorado. So a couple just has to turn to themselves and say, we are now married. I choose you as my partner, whatever, and they're married. And then I didn't sign any of the paperwork, obviously. The cantor would sign the paperwork. So that's how I addressed it there. And I have officiated at this point only at Jew and Jew weddings, but I have also stood in a Catholic church and put a talit over a couple where the daughter was the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and I had buried that Holocaust survivor, and I officiated at the funeral, and I was the rabbi for that Holocaust survivor's, spouse as well. And so I got up in the middle of the ceremony and did a blessing and wrapped them in the Holocaust survivor's talit and did things like that. So there are things that rabbis are now doing that were previously forbidden. The explanation I give, like I said, is if somebody chooses not to convert to Judaism, but they want a Jewish wedding, I really have to counsel that person through the process of why they are not choosing to convert. And it's always a valid reason. My grandmother, would drop dead if she knew I converted, right? Or, I'm honoring my family's traditions, or I believe in Jesus as my Lord and Savior. There are people that enter a partnership with somebody who's Jewish, who want to go to synagogue and who want to raise their children Jewishly, but who are mamish Christians, right? I can't officiate for somebody who is a Christian. I'm a rabbi. I can't validate their belief system under the chuppah. It makes no sense. And when I explain it to them in that way, they are not insulted and they actually respect that statement. They respect my position. I've never had anybody not become a member of my congregation because I wouldn't officiate at their wedding.
Thank you very
even
much.
when I was a rabbi of a conservative congregation,
Thank
I
you.
even had couples then who still, because there is a way to bring them in and to journey with them and to still be part of their union, right? While respecting both beliefs.
One last question from Becky Miller, and then we'll conclude the program.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. I know that in the conservative movement, they passed a path once you're married. And Jeff and I were ambassadors for this program. And we went around and we spoke to other synagogues and taught about this program. And it was a wonderful program, and whereby you actually could do anything but become president of the congregation. Am I correct, Rabbi?
Yep.
You could be in sisterhood and men's club.
Yep.
You couldn't touch the Torah, but you could come up to the bima when your child was bar mitzvahed or bat mitzvahed, correct?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So you could actually take part in almost every aspect of the congregation.
You can touch the Torah. A non-Jew can touch the Torah.
Okay.
You can't make the Torah pasul by touching it, right? But, and there were days where women, like at my bat mitzvah, I wasn't allowed to touch the Torah, right? So women weren't allowed, and women can touch the Torah now because it was believed that if a woman was menstruating, then she was impure, and if she touched the Torah, she was, right? That's not a thing. You can't make the Torah, you make the Torah impure by ripping it apart, by scribbling in it, by defacing the law of God, by being obscene in front of the Torah, whatever. But a non-Jew can touch the Torah. What a non-Jew can't do is say the blessing before and after the Torah by themselves, because it says Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Amim, right? Because the one who has chosen us from amongst all other people, and that person is not choosing to be part of the chosen people, right? So that sentence doesn't make sense. But I even allow them to come up in a group aliyah. So if their partner is Jewish, then they can say it with them, as long as somebody Jewish is saying the prayer. The non-Jewish person can, if they want to, because they just like to sometimes, and it makes them feel part of it. I don't have a problem with them saying it, as long as somebody Jewish is actually saying it. And I remind that person, your statement is not valid, right? I'm not going to say you're not a valid person, but your statement isn't valid because you're not part of this. But we accept you as a person who's part of this celebration and part of, the community, and be part of everything else. And you can be a board member, and you can participate in things. We just have to be careful if somebody is mamish Christian, right? That what they're bringing to the board could be problematic, but most people are very respectful of that, and they know they're fighting for their spouses and their families' Jewish beliefs, and so they're usually respectful, but they can be part of all of that, which is a beautiful thing. And I love teaching courses to couples who are in that place. I think that's a great course that the conservative movement has offered.
I want to jump in and offer our president, Dr. Eric Faber, an opportunity to ask a question. His hand was up the whole time, but I was busy looking at the speaker, so I apologize, Mr. President.
No problem. Rabbi Moskowitz, on behalf of all of us here, I'd like to thank you for a really superb presentation. My question for you, which you alluded to at the very beginning, is how can the conservative movement retain and engage the younger generations? Rather than have them drift towards reform or elsewhere, what are your thoughts about engaging the younger generation?
Well, there's lots of ways. One of the ways I did it was I offered a shorter service before the main service for families of young children. Like on Friday night, I offered like a 6 o'clock, you offer a service that's amenable to children and people who are managing children, where the kids could come in their pajamas, and then we would have dinner right after. And it was a really short, user-friendly service where the parents could sit and use a prayer book that was super user-friendly for them. I designed a prayer book for, with bigger print and simpler prayers and transliteration. And the kids were all up on the bima so the parents could sit back and relax. And it was, again, short and user-friendly and easy. And then we served dinner for everybody, and then we sent them all home. And then the next crowd came in for the longer service, right? So offering them something that is more amenable to their needs. Family education on Sundays, where it's an easier day for people to get together. I had a soccer minion at one of my synagogues where the kids who all played soccer came before services, and we had a short minion with those kids and their families. And then they went off to soccer, and then the next crowd came in, for the longer service. So you have to just kind of figure out what the needs are of that younger community, and then create things that they want to come to. And it's not that hard. It's a lot of extra work, again, for the leadership of the congregation, because then you're offering, often 2 services or sometimes even 3 services, depending on the situation. But there are ways to appeal to younger people, and it's as simple as just creating programming or creating a service that is more user-friendly for their generation. And it sometimes just takes the leadership of the rabbi or the congregation to reach out to those people, advertising it, talking to people, traveling around like, Becky and Jeff did, and going to other synagogues and going to other places. You're not trying to steal congregants, but you're saying we're also offering a program. While you're, going to this program, you might want to come to this program as well. And you don't want to over-program, obviously. You do run the risk of doing too many things. What ended up happening with my children's service that was short and a half hour and was designed only for children, is that the older congregation, the people that were older in the congregation, their grandparents liked that service because they liked seeing the littles on the bima. And so they started coming to that service. And so the service went from a half hour to an hour. And instead of having 2 services, we only had 1 service. But then we all had a meal after that we could share. And the kids ran around, and it was total chaos. And it was chaos during the service as well. But the people that came to that service loved it. And the people that didn't like that service, well, the following week I didn't offer that service. And so the following week, those people came to the regular service. And so there's ways to address the needs of both communities within a community. And often when you're addressing the needs of one part of the community, you end up addressing all of their needs, because who doesn't want a congregation with little kids running around on the bima? It's a chaotic and beautiful moment. There were people that complained. I'm just saying, there were people that complained about that service, but I offered a service right after that. So we ate the meal together. So during the dinner, the people that were coming for the second service came for dinner as well. So both groups were able to congregate during that moment. And then we had this other service. But as time moved on, that other service, the congregation stopped coming to that. It started waning, and they just came to the early service. And there's so many ways. You just meet with your ritual committee, you meet with your board, you meet with your congregation, you figure out what your goals are, and then you do it. You just start doing it, and people will come. If you build it, they will come. It happens in the community. It's not, if there are people in the community, there has to be, the population you're striving for has to be present somewhere, but it's not that hard to do.
Well, on that uplifting and positive note, thank you very much, Rabbi Moskowitz. We certainly appreciate all of your time